Mae Calloway's hands were shaking when she slapped the man across the face. Not because she meant to lose control. Not because she was the kind of woman who hit people. But because Dr. Preston had just looked at the bleeding Mexican boy on his examination table. Looked at his mother's desperate face. Looked at the 12 cents she'd pressed into his palm and said, "Not enough." The crack of her palm against his cheek silenced every person in that pharmacy. And Mae knew, even before the ringing faded, that she had just destroyed any chance of a quiet departure from Denton's Crossing, Texas. If you want to know what happened after that slap, and what one man's quiet voice in the darkness changed forever, subscribe to this channel and stay with me until the very end. Tell me in the comments what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The train east left Denton's Crossing every Tuesday at 8:30 in the morning, and Mae Calloway had been standing on this platform for 6 of the last 7 Tuesdays, watching it leave without her. Today was going to be different. She told herself that as she set her leather bag down on the worn wooden planks and adjusted the collar of her traveling coat. She told herself that as she checked the time on James's old pocket watch, the one with the cracked crystal she'd never bothered to replace. She told herself that as she studied the eastern horizon, where the tracks disappeared into flat Texas nothing, and tried to remember what it had felt like to have a plan. 7 weeks ago, she'd stepped off a westbound train with a bag full of medical supplies, $40 in savings, and a letter from Dr. Samuel Greer in Santa Fe, offering her a position assisting at his practice. She'd intended to be back on a train within 48 hours, change trains in Denton's Crossing, spend one night at the boarding house, and continue west. That was before the boy. His name was Miguel. He was 9 years old, and he had a gash along his forearm from a fall near the railroad yard where his father worked, laying track. His mother, a small woman named Consuela, with flour on her apron and terror in her eyes, had brought him to Dr. Preston's pharmacy on Main Street because it was the only medical establishment in town. Mae had walked in behind them. She'd needed iodine. She'd watched Dr. Preston examine the wound without expression. She'd watched him turn to Consuela and name a price. She'd watched Consuela count out everything in her pocketbook, 12 cents and a button, and hold it out with trembling hands. She'd watched Preston say, "Not enough," and turn away. And something inside Mae Calloway, something that had been wound tight for 7 years of widowhood and hard work and being told what was appropriate for a woman in her position, had simply snapped. She hadn't planned the slap. It was the least clinical thing she'd done in a decade. "Good Lord, woman," Preston said, his hand going to his face. He was staring at her like she'd grown a second head. "Do you have any idea who I am?" "A man who just refused to treat a child," Mae said. Her voice was very steady. She found that remarkable, given that her whole body was vibrating like a struck bell. "I have a reasonable idea what you are." She turned to Consuela. "Sit him up on that table. I'll need your cleanest cloth and whatever water you can find." She opened her bag and went to work. The pharmacy had gone completely silent. Mae could feel every eye in the room like a physical pressure against the back of her neck. But she kept her hands moving and her focus on Miguel's arm. The cut was deep but clean. 6 stitches. She'd done worse with less. "You cannot practice medicine in this county without a license," Preston said behind her. "I'm not practicing medicine. I'm doing first aid." Mae tied off the last stitch without looking up, which any decent person would have done 20 minutes ago. "I want you out of my establishment." "I'm leaving." She packed her supplies, straightened up, and looked at Consuela. "Keep it dry for 3 days. Change the wrapping every morning. If it gets hot or starts to smell, find me." She gave the woman the boarding house address, without thinking about whether she'd still be there to find. She walked out of the pharmacy into the sharp October sunlight. Behind her, she could hear Preston's voice rising, could hear him telling someone to fetch the sheriff, could hear the particular tone of a man who had never been contradicted by a woman and didn't intend to start now. Mae walked 2 blocks down Main Street before she realized her legs had stopped listening to her brain. She stood in front of Rosaria's eating house, a narrow building with blue-painted shutters that smelled like cumin and wood smoke, and simply stood there, her bag in her hand, breathing. The door opened. A woman appeared in the frame, dark-eyed and unhurried, drying her hands on her apron. "You're the woman who slapped Preston," she said. "News travels fast. In Denton's Crossing, it travels faster than the wind and with less mercy." She stepped aside. "Come in before the sheriff arrives and gives you a reason to run." That was how Mae met Rosaria Vega. She was not given to sentimentality, but she thought later that it was the first moment in 7 weeks she'd felt something that resembled solid ground. Rosaria sat her down at a corner table and put coffee in front of her without asking. The cafe was half full, with railroad workers taking their noon break. Mexican men, mostly, talking low over their plates. A few of them glanced at Mae. One nodded. "You're the woman from the boarding house," Rosaria said, sitting across from her with her own cup. "Mrs. Calloway, you've been here 6 Tuesdays." "7. 7, Rosaria repeated. "Every week you go to the platform. Every week the train leaves and you're still here." She tilted her head. "Why?" Mae looked at her coffee. "I keep finding reasons." "And today?" "Today I'm leaving." Rosaria looked at her with the expression of a woman who had heard that particular sentence applied to that particular person several times before. She didn't argue. She just refilled Mae's coffee without comment. Sheriff Walt Calhoun arrived while Mae was on her second cup. He was a heavy-set man with a thick mustache and the expression of someone who found his own job inconvenient. He pulled up a chair, turned it backwards, and sat down like he was settling in for a conversation rather than an official visit. "Dr. Preston wants you charged with assault," he said. "Also, unlicensed practice of medicine. I stitched a child's arm on his premises, without his permission, using supplies you didn't pay for." "I used my own supplies." Calhoun rubbed his mustache. "Be that as it may, Mrs. Calloway. Preston is a respected member of this community. He has friends on the town council, friends who don't much appreciate a stranger coming in and slapping people around. He refused to treat an injured child because the family was 12 cents short. That is a business decision." Mae looked at him for a long moment. "A business decision," she repeated. "Ma'am, I don't make the rules." "Who does?" Calhoun opened his mouth, closed it, and looked at the table. Something shifted in his face. Not guilt exactly, but the shadow of it. "I'm not going to arrest you," he said finally, lower than before. "But I am going to strongly advise you to be on that train tomorrow morning." He stood up, replaced his hat, and left without another word. Rosaria watched him go. "He means it kindly," she said. "That is the most disturbing thing about Walt Calhoun. He genuinely does." "Who owns Preston?" Mae asked. Rosaria looked at her without expression. "The same man who owns the railroad, the salt mine, and the western half of Archer County." She paused. "The same man who decides which businesses stay open and which ones find their leases canceled for no particular reason." Reginald Foss. It wasn't the question. Mae had heard the name 4 times in 7 weeks, each time with a different tone. Careful, resigned, frightened, but always with the same fundamental content. Foss decided. Foss approved. Foss determined what was good for Denton's Crossing. "You've done your research," Rosaria said. "I'm a widow with medical training and time to observe." Mae set down her cup. "Where is his office?" "Mrs. Calloway." Rosaria's voice was quiet but precise. "You are getting on that train tomorrow." "I know." "Then why are you asking where Foss's office is?" Mae didn't answer immediately. She looked out the window at Main Street, at the people moving through the dust and sunlight, at the railroad workers heading back to the yard, at a woman she recognized from the boarding house hurrying past with her eyes down, at the ordinary texture of a town that had decided what it was and didn't intend to discuss it. "Because I want to understand," she said finally, "what I'm leaving behind." She was halfway back to the boarding house when she heard her name. Not her name exactly, just, "Ma'am," said in a voice that made her stop anyway. She turned. The man standing in the gap between the hardware store and the telegraph office was tall, lean, and dressed with the practical simplicity of someone who spent most of his time outdoors. He had a judge's badge on his coat that looked slightly incongruous against the rest of him, like someone had pinned it there as a reminder rather than an identity. Dark eyes, dark hair going silver at the temples, and an expression that was very carefully neutral in the way that only cost something when you worked at it. "You're Judge Holt," Mae said. "Daniel Holt." He came out of the gap, stopped about 6 feet away, and kept his hands visible. It was a deliberate gesture, she noticed. The gesture of a man who understood how he could be perceived and chose to modify it. "I heard what happened at Preston's." Everyone did. "I heard what happened before that, what he said to the boy's mother." Something moved in his face, quick and controlled, but she caught it. "What Preston did was wrong." Mae studied him. "Are you telling me that as the judge or as a person?" A pause. A very small one, but she clocked it. "As a person." "And as the judge?" Another pause, longer this time. He looked down at the badge on his coat like he'd forgotten it was there, and wasn't pleased to be reminded. "As the judge, I'd advise you to do what Calhoun told you. Get on the train tomorrow morning." "That seems to be the consensus." "It's not a consensus. It's a warning." His voice stayed even, but there was something underneath it she couldn't quite name. "Foss knows your name now. He knows what you did. And Foss doesn't like disruption." "Disruption," Mae said. "Interesting word for stitching a child's arm." "It's not about the stitches. It's about who watched you do it. Half the workers from the North Yard were in that pharmacy. Men who spend 12 hours a day building wealth for Reginald Foss at wages that barely cover their rent." He paused again. "Men who just watched a woman from nowhere stand up to the man Foss owns." Mae was quiet for a moment. "You're saying I made them think something was possible?" "I'm saying Foss will work to make them think the opposite. Quickly." The afternoon light was long and gold across the dust of Main Street. Somewhere down the block, a door banged. A dog barked twice and went silent. Mae looked at Daniel Holt's face and tried to determine which thing he was. A message from Foss dressed up as concern, or a man who was genuinely afraid for her and didn't know how to say it without stepping outside a role he'd been playing so long he'd forgotten how to take it off. She decided she couldn't tell yet. "Thank you for the warning, Judge," she said. "It's Daniel." She met his eyes. "I'll consider what you've said, Daniel." She walked back to the boarding house, packed her bag in 40 minutes, and lay down on the narrow bed staring at the water-stained ceiling while the Texas night settled over everything. Tomorrow morning, 8:30, she would be on that platform, and this time she would get on the train. She believed that right up until 3 in the morning, when someone knocked on her door. It was Elena Vega, Rosaria's daughter, 16 years old, ink-stained fingers, breathless and pale, with blood on the front of her blouse that wasn't hers. "It's Hector," she said, "one of the workers from the North Yard. He fell." The railroad foreman won't send for help. My mother said you'd know what to do." Mae was already reaching for her bag. "How far?" 20 minutes on foot, 10 by horse." "Does anyone in your household own a horse?" "No, but—" Elena hesitated. "Judge Holt does." Mae looked at her for one long moment. Then she picked up her bag and her coat and her lamp, and she followed Elena out into the dark. She did not think about the train. Hector Ruiz was 24 years old and had a broken femur from a collapsed scaffolding section on the new water tower the railroad was building on the north side of town. He was conscious, which was both good and terrible. And 3 of his crew members were crouched around him in the dirt, doing their best and managing very little. Mae went to work. She heard Elena knock on Daniel Holt's door while she was still assessing the break. Heard Daniel's voice, low and unhurried. Heard the sound of him already moving before the girl had finished her sentence. He arrived with a lantern and 2 straight pieces of lumber without being asked, and held the light exactly where she needed it, without her having to say so. They didn't speak much. They didn't need to. "He needs a real doctor," Mae said when she had the splint set and the bleeding from the secondary laceration controlled. "Not tomorrow. Tonight." "Preston won't come out here at this hour." Preston wouldn't come out here in the middle of the afternoon for a family he didn't consider worth treating. She sat back on her heels and looked at Daniel. "Is there anyone else?" "Not in Denton's Crossing." "Then I'll stay with him until morning and send for transport to the nearest hospital town at first light." She glanced up. "Which is?" "Wichita Falls, 30 miles. Mae absorbed this. She looked at Hector's face, at the sweat and pain and the stubborn grip he had on his own consciousness, at the 3 men from his crew who hadn't moved since she'd arrived, at Elena, who had been handing her instruments without being asked for the past 40 minutes, with the calm focus of someone who had read about this and thought about it, and been waiting for the chance to do it. She looked at Daniel. He was looking at her with an expression she recognized because she had worn it herself once, standing in a hospital corridor in Cincinnati, while men in authority debated what was practical and what was possible, while James's patients lay in their beds and quietly deteriorated. It was the expression of a person who understood exactly what the right thing was, and had spent a long time finding reasons not to do it. "You're not getting on that train tomorrow," he said. It was not a question. "No," Mae said, "I'm not." He nodded slowly, like he'd known that before he said it. Then he sat down on the ground with his lantern and stayed. They were there until dawn. Elena fell asleep against a fence post around 4 in the morning, with her knees pulled up and her ink-stained hands folded in her lap. The crew members took turns keeping watch. Hector's breathing steadied as the hours passed, and the first gray light began to show at the edge of the flat Texas sky. Mae sat with her back against the wall of the workshed and her bag between her feet, and let herself be still for the first time in 7 weeks. The exhaustion was enormous, and she was inside it the way you're inside weather. Daniel was about 6 feet away, his lantern burning low. She wasn't sure when he'd started watching her, but when she turned her head, she found him looking, and he didn't look away. "Why are you still here?" she asked. "You've done what you could. Hector's stable." "So have you." "I'm the one who'll be here in the morning." "So will I." He paused. "Unless you'd rather I wasn't." Mae studied his face in the last of the lantern light. The badge on his coat was invisible now in the dark. He was just a man who had sat up all night in the dirt and wasn't making anything of it. "You can stay," she said. They were quiet for a while. "You know what Foss will do," Daniel said eventually, "when he hears you didn't leave." "I expect he'll make things difficult." "He's good at that." "So am I." Mae looked at the eastern sky where the dark was starting to give. "Judge Holt." "Daniel." "Daniel." The name was still strange on her tongue, like something that needed to be worn in. 6 years you've been sitting in that courtroom, handing down decisions that Foss tells you to hand down. He went very still. I've been here 7 weeks, Mae said. I've heard the stories. The Garza family who lost their land claim after they complained about wages. The teacher from the school who got run out of town for letting Mexican children sit in the front row. The merchant who tried to organize a labor complaint and found his business license suddenly revoked. She paused. All of it went through your court. The silence stretched long enough that she thought he might not answer. Yes, he said finally. One word, flat and without excuse. Why? She heard him exhale, a long, slow breath. Because I told myself that staying inside the system was better than walking away from it, that I could limit the damage from the inside. He stopped. Because it was easier than fighting. Because James Harlan Foss does not make it easy to say no and keep living in this county. And now? Another long silence. The sky was going gray-pink in the east, the first bird starting up somewhere in the scrub brush. I sat up all night in the dirt, Daniel said slowly, because a woman who has been in this town 7 weeks did something I'd been telling myself for 6 years was impossible. He looked at her directly. I don't know what that means yet, but I know what it means that you're not getting on that train. Hector stirred. Mae was on her feet before the thought finished forming, moving to check his pulse, his temperature, the set of the splint. Behind her she heard Daniel stand, heard the soft sounds of him waking Elena gently, heard him speaking to the crew members in a voice low enough not to carry. In the growing light, Denton's Crossing looked like any other small Texas town. Dust and timber, and the silver lines of the railroad reaching in both directions toward a horizon that promised everything and delivered according to its own schedule. Mae Calloway looked at it and felt, for the first time in 7 weeks, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. She was going to hate every minute of what came next. She was going to be cold and tired and frightened and furious. She was going to stand in front of men who had never taken a woman seriously and make them take her seriously by force of sheer, relentless presence. But she was here, and she had work to do. Hector Ruiz was moved to Wichita Falls on a wagon bed padded with blankets before 7 in the morning. His wife, a small woman named Pilar, who had arrived at dawn with red eyes and steady hands, held his hand the entire time, and didn't cry until the wagon was out of sight. Then she cried quietly against the fence post for exactly 2 minutes, wiped her face, and asked Mae what she owed. Nothing, Mae said. Pilar looked at her with the particular expression of a woman who had learned that nothing was never actually nothing. Then what do you want? To know that he gets proper care when he arrives. Can someone send word? My brother works the telegraph in Wichita Falls. Pilar paused. I'll have him send word to you directly. I'd appreciate that. They stood for a moment in the early morning quiet, 2 women on opposite sides of a dozen invisible lines that Denton's Crossing had drawn and redrawn over 30 years of settling itself into a shape that suited certain people and no one else. Then Pilar nodded once, the way women nod when they've decided something, and walked away toward town. Elena was still asleep against the fence post. Mae let her sleep another 20 minutes before touching her shoulder. Train's gone, Elena said immediately, without opening her eyes. 1/2 an hour ago. The girl opened her eyes then. They were very dark and very clear, the eyes of someone who processed the world faster than she let on. Are you angry? No. My mother will be. Your mother can manage me. Mae held out a hand and pulled her to her feet. You did good work last night. Where did you learn instrument handling? Elena brushed dirt from her skirt with quick, efficient movements. Tom Birch has every issue of the American Journal of Medicine going back to 1861. He lets me read in the back office when the press isn't running. She glanced sideways at Mae. I want to be a doctor. Mae looked at her. I know. Nobody thinks that's possible. I didn't ask what other people think. Something shifted in Elena's face, quick and young and fierce. She pressed her lips together and didn't say anything else, but she walked a little straighter the rest of the way back to her mother's cafe. Rosaria was standing in the doorway when they arrived. She looked at her daughter from head to toe, cataloging the night in the particular inventory of a mother who has learned to assess damage before expressing emotion. Then she looked at Mae. Sit down, she said. Both of you. She put eggs and tortillas and coffee on the table and sat across from them with her own cup and didn't speak until Mae had eaten half her plate. Preston is filing a formal complaint, Rosaria said, against you and against Daniel Holt for providing assistance to an unlicensed practitioner. Mae set down her fork. When did you hear this? 20 minutes ago. Walt Calhoun came in for breakfast and told me. He looked like a man delivering bad news he didn't enjoy delivering. She paused. That is the most you can say for Walt Calhoun. A complaint to whom? The County Medical Board, and to Foss directly, though that's not official and doesn't need to be. Rosaria wrapped both hands around her cup. Foss will use the complaint to have you removed from town, possibly arrested if Preston pushes hard enough for the assault charge. She looked at Mae steadily. You need to understand what you're walking into. I understand it. Mae, Rosaria's voice was quiet and precise. I have lived in this town for 22 years. I have watched Foss destroy 3 businesses, 2 families, and 1 man's reputation so thoroughly that he left Texas entirely and was never heard from again. I am not telling you this to frighten you. I am telling you this because I need to know if you understand the difference between courage and consequence. Mae was quiet for a moment. Outside, the morning sounds of Denton's Crossing were starting up. Wagon wheels, voices, the distant rhythmic clang from the railroad yard that never fully stopped. My husband died of typhoid fever, Mae said. He was 41 years old and the finest doctor I ever watched work. He spent 2 years before he died trying to get the Cincinnati City Council to improve the water filtration on the east side of the river, where most of the poor families lived. He filed reports, he attended meetings, he wrote letters to every official who would receive them. She picked up her fork again. The council approved the filtration improvements 4 months after he was buried. Cost of the project was 1/3 what he'd estimated. They put a plaque on the building with his name on it. Rosaria watched her. James would have found that very funny, Mae said. He was not a man who needed a plaque. He needed people to stop dying of preventable illness. She looked up. I am not afraid of Reginald Foss. I am afraid of being the kind of person who understands exactly what needs doing and gets on the train anyway. Rosaria held her gaze for a long moment. Then she nodded, once, with the gravity of a woman extending something she didn't give lightly. Then you'll need a place to work, she said. My back storeroom. It's not much, but it has a table and a water pump and more square footage than it looks. Rosaria, I have 23 workers from the North Yard who eat here every day. Their families have been riding 30 miles to Wichita Falls for medical care because Preston won't touch them for what they can pay. She stood up and began clearing the table with the brisk efficiency of someone who had made a decision and intended to live with it. You'll treat them here. Whatever they can give, they give. Whatever they can't, they don't. Mae stood. That will put you directly in Foss's sight. I have been in Foss's sight for 22 years. Rosaria smiled, and it was not a warm smile, but it was a real one. He has never quite worked out what to do with me. The storeroom was exactly as described. Not much, but functional, and Mae had worked in worse. She spent the rest of the morning converting it with Elena's help, the girl moving with quiet, competent energy and an organizational instinct that reminded Mae of herself at that age, which was either encouraging or alarming, depending on how you looked at it. They had been working for about 2 hours when Daniel Holt appeared in the doorway. He was cleaned up from the night before and back in his judge's coat, badge and all, but he held his hat in his hands, the way he had the first afternoon she'd met him, and he looked like a man who had rehearsed something and then decided not to say it. "Preston filed the complaint," he said. "I heard. The county medical board won't act on it quickly. They're in Abilene, and they only convene monthly. But Foss doesn't need the board. He can apply pressure through other channels." Mae set down the box she was reorganizing. "What kind of pressure?" "Your boarding house is owned by a woman named Clara Fitch. Clara Fitch's late husband owed Foss $1,100 when he died. Foss forgave the debt in exchange for certain considerations." He paused. "One of those considerations is that she does not rent rooms to people Foss objects to." The room was very quiet. Elena had gone still beside the supply table. "I see," Mae said. "You'll be asked to leave by tonight." He held her gaze. "I have a spare room. The house is large, and there is an entirely separate entrance, and it is no one's business but a practical solution to a practical problem." Mae looked at him for a long moment. He bore the look without flinching, which she gave him credit for. "You understand how that will be interpreted," she said. "I understand how everything in this town is interpreted. I've stopped letting that govern my decisions." A pause. A small one, but she was learning to read them. "Starting recently." "Starting last night," she said. "Starting last night," he agreed. Elena made a small sound that she converted immediately into a cough and became very focused on counting bandage rolls. "I'll consider it," Mae said. "Thank you, Daniel." He nodded, put his hat back on, and left. Mae looked at Elena. "Don't," Mae said. "I wasn't saying anything," Elena said. "You were thinking it very loudly." Elena put down the bandage rolls and looked at her directly, with the expression of someone who had decided the territory required honesty. "He sat up all night in the dirt," she said. "When Foss hears about that, it won't just be you in trouble. It'll be him, too." "I know." "He knows that, too." "I know that as well." Elena held her gaze for another moment, then picked up her bandage rolls and returned to counting. But something had shifted in the room, the way temperature shifts before weather, and Mae felt it and filed it away with the careful discipline of a woman who had learned that feelings were real, but timing was everything. Clara Fitch came to see her at 2 in the afternoon. She was a small, gray-haired woman with the apologetic bearing of someone who had been ashamed of themselves for a long time and had run out of ways to make it comfortable. "Mrs. Calloway?" she said, in the doorway of the storeroom. She couldn't quite make eye contact. "I'm so sorry. I want you to know I think what you did was right. What you've always done is right. But I can't—" Her voice broke slightly. "I have the house. It's all I have left of Henry. And if Foss calls that debt back in, Clara—" Mae's voice was not unkind. "You don't need to explain. I'm a coward." "You're a woman protecting the only thing you have. Those aren't the same." Mae wiped her hands on her apron. "I'll be out by 5. Clara Fitch left looking somehow worse than when she'd arrived, which was the particular cruelty of situations where everyone was simultaneously victim and participant. Mae watched her go and felt nothing so simple as anger. She moved into Daniel Holt's spare room at 5:15. The house was on the north edge of town, set back from the road, with a separate entrance exactly as promised, and a garden that had gone to seed in the way of gardens belonging to people who thought about maintaining them and then didn't. The spare room was clean and plain and smelled like cedar and disuse. Daniel showed her in without ceremony and showed her where the water pump was and told her there was coffee on the stove if she wanted it, and left her alone. Mae sat on the edge of the plain bed in the plain room and looked at the plain walls and thought, not for the first time, about the difference between the life she had planned and the life she appeared to be living. James would have found this extremely funny too. The first patients came the next morning. Word had moved through the North Yard and the Mexican quarter of town, the way it moved in places where people had long since learned not to use official channels. Quietly and specifically, and with the precision of information that matters. By 8 in the morning, there were 4 people waiting in the alley behind Rosaria's cafe. Mae worked through the morning without stopping. A child with an infected cut. A man with a cough that had settled deep into his chest over 2 winters. A woman who had been ignoring a lump in her side for 6 months because there was nowhere to go and no money to go there with. An elderly man with cataracts so advanced he was navigating by memory and the positions of shadows. She treated what she could treat, referred what she couldn't, and wrote careful notes in her own system that James had taught her. The kind of record-keeping that turned individual cases into patterns, and patterns into evidence. Elena was there every morning. She did not ask permission. She simply appeared, washed her hands, and went to work. Mae stopped pretending she was going to send her home. On the 3rd day, Tom Birch appeared. He was a thin, slightly stooped man in an old suit, with the watchful eyes of someone who had spent decades observing things he wasn't allowed to write about. He introduced himself briefly, accepted coffee from Rosaria, and looked at Mae with the expression of a man taking inventory. "You're making quite a stir," he said. "I've been told. Foss knows everything you've done since you missed that train. He knows about the Ruiz boy. He knows about Daniel Holt. He knows about this." He gestured vaguely at the storeroom and its contents. "He's deciding what to do about it." "What are his options?" Tom ticked them off without drama. "Run you out of town through legal pressure. The medical board complaint is the obvious tool. Economically isolate you. Pressure Rosaria's suppliers the way he's pressured others. Discredit you. Manufacture a story about your character or your competence. Or wait and see if you solve the problem yourself by leaving." He paused. That last one has worked for him more than the others. People tend to leave on their own when Denton's Crossing becomes uncomfortable enough. "I've been uncomfortable before." "Not like this." Tom looked at her over the rim of his cup. The difference between Foss and most powerful men is that Foss is patient. He doesn't act in anger. He plans. He set down his cup. "I have been watching him plan things for 11 years, Mrs. Calloway. I have been recording what I observe. I have," he said very quietly, "a considerable amount of recorded observation." Mae looked at him. "What kind of records?" "The kind that would be interesting to a federal marshal, or a newspaper in Dallas." He paused. "Or a judge who had recently rediscovered his willingness to do his job." The word hung in the air between them. "Why are you telling me this?" Mae asked. Tom Birch was quiet for a moment. He looked at his coffee cup, at the storeroom wall, at some middle distance that seemed to contain something she couldn't see. "My wife grew up in a town like this one," he said finally, "before I knew her. A man like Foss decided she and her family were inconvenient and made life impossible for them until they left. She spent 30 years asking me why I stayed in Denton's Crossing and did nothing." He looked up. "She died last spring. I never gave her a satisfactory answer." Mae held his gaze. "And now?" "And now a woman from nowhere sat up all night in the dirt with a broken railroad worker and missed her train and set up a medical practice in a cafe storeroom. The smallest suggestion of something crossed his face. Not quite a smile, but its intention. It seemed like the right time to have a different kind of answer ready. That evening, Mae found Daniel on the porch of his house, watching the sun go down over the flat Texas country. She sat in the other chair without asking, and they were quiet together for a while, which was becoming a habit, and not an uncomfortable one. "Tom Birch came to see me today," she said. Daniel nodded. "I know. He came to see me this afternoon. He has records on Foss going back 11 years. I know that too." He was quiet for a moment. Tom has been holding on to those records like a man holding a match near a powder keg, waiting for the right moment, or the right reason. And now he thinks he has one. Daniel looked sideways at her. "Do you understand what happens if we move on this? If we go to the county authorities or Dallas or federal?" "Foss comes back hard before the authorities can act," Mae said. "He discredits the records, pressures the witnesses, uses every institutional tool he has to bury it." She paused. "And there will be consequences for everyone who stands with us." "Yes." "Rosaria, Tom, Elena." She paused again. "You." "Yes." The evening was purple and orange and enormous in the Texas way, the sky too big to look at directly. Somewhere in the distance a coyote called once and was silent. "I need to know something," Mae said. "Ask it." 6 years, she said. 6 years of Foss. 6 years of decisions you're ashamed of. What changed last night? Not what you told me. The real reason. Daniel was quiet for so long that she thought he might not answer. When he spoke, his voice was very level and very deliberate, the voice of a man choosing each word like he was stepping across uncertain ground. "I watched you work," he said. "In the dark, in the dirt, for a man you'd never met, in a town that was already trying to push you out. And it wasn't heroic. It wasn't dramatic. You were tired, and your hands were shaking from the cold, and at one point, you sat back on your heels and closed your eyes for 30 seconds. And then, just kept going." He paused. "I've been waiting 6 years for a reason good enough to justify doing the right thing. Something large enough, significant enough, to outweigh the cost." He looked at her. "But you didn't wait for a reason good enough. You just did what was in front of you to do." Mae was quiet. The coyote called again, closer this time. "That's not particularly heroic either," she said. "No," Daniel said. "That's what made it matter." They sat in the cooling evening until the last light was gone. Two people on opposite sides of a door that was becoming increasingly difficult to pretend was still closed, in a town that was about to discover what happened when the wrong people finally decided that patience had its limits. The letter from the county medical board arrived on a Monday, which Mae had begun to think of as Foss's preferred day for bad news. He seemed to understand that Mondays already carried their own weight, and that adding to them required less effort. The letter was formal and precise, and informed Mae Calloway that her practice of medicine without a valid license in the state of Texas was under investigation, and that she was required to cease all medical activity pending review by the full board, convening in 6 weeks in Abilene. It was signed by 3 names she didn't recognize, and countersigned by Dr. Everett Preston, who had listed his credentials in full. Mae read it twice at the kitchen table, while Daniel drank his coffee and watched her face. 6 weeks, she said. 6 weeks. He could have had this letter sent in the first week. Why wait nearly 2 months? Daniel set down his cup. "Because in the first week, you were a stranger making trouble. Now you're someone people know, someone they've been coming to." He paused. "Shutting you down now causes more pain, more anger, That's the point. He wants the community to feel it. Mae folded the letter with the crisp, deliberate movements of someone managing themselves carefully. He wants them to blame me for the disruption. He wants them to learn that caring about you costs something, so that next time they don't. She was quiet for a moment. Outside, she could hear the early sounds of Rosaria's cafe opening up. The scrape of chairs, voices in Spanish, the smell of coffee and wood smoke drifting through the thin walls. "I'm not stopping," she said. "I know. The letter says to cease medical activity. I am going to interpret that narrowly and continue doing exactly what I've been doing, and let them come to Denton's Crossing and tell me in person that cleaning wounds and treating fever constitutes the practice of medicine in the legal sense." Daniel looked at her with the expression she'd come to recognize as his version of almost smiling. "That is an aggressive interpretation. I am an aggressive interpreter." He picked up his cup again. "I'll have Tom print a summary of the complaint in this week's paper. Let people read it themselves and draw conclusions about who benefits from you stopping. Foss will pressure Tom. Tom has been waiting 11 years to be pressured in a direction he actually wants to go." Daniel stood. "I have court this morning. A land dispute that Foss's attorney filed on his behalf against the Garza family. Again." He said the last word with the flatness of a man describing a recurring injury. "I am going to rule on the actual merits of the case for the first time in 4 years, and see what happens." Mae looked up at him. "Daniel." "I know." "He will come after you directly." "I know that too." He put on his coat, badge and all, and looked at her across the kitchen table. "Mae, I have been the respectable face on Reginald Foss's machinery for 6 years. Every ruling I handed down his way, every family that lost land or business or standing because my court legitimized what he wanted. That is my record, not just his." He was quiet for a moment. "I would like to have a different record." She held his gaze. "Then go make one." He left. Mae sat with her coffee and the folded letter and the particular quality of early morning silence that sits between a decision and its consequences. She was still sitting there when Elena came through the back door, washed her hands at the pump, and looked at the letter on the table without touching it. "How bad?" Elena asked. "Bad enough. Are we stopping?" "No." Elena nodded and tied on her apron. "Then I need to tell you something. Last night, 2 men came to the cafe after closing. I was in the back and they didn't know I was there." She aligned the supply jars with precise movements that Mae recognized as something to do with her hands while she said a difficult thing. "They were talking to my mother, telling her that her lease renewal was coming up in January, and that property values in this section of town had been reassessed, and the new rate would be 3 times the current one." Mae set down her cup. "Foss owns the building. Foss owns 6 of the 8 buildings on this block." Elena's voice was steady and furious in equal measure, the particular combination of someone who had grown up knowing a thing in their body before they had the words for it. "He's never raised the rate before because my mother's cafe feeds his workers, and it's cheaper than building a company kitchen. But now she's associated with me. Now she's associated with you." Elena looked at her directly. "She didn't tell me about it this morning. I had to tell her I'd heard. She said she was handling it. She said not to worry." Her jaw tightened. "She always says that." Mae was quiet for a moment. "What do you want me to do?" "I want you to tell me that standing up to Foss is actually possible. Not just brave, actually possible. Because my mother has 22 years in this town, and I don't want to watch her lose everything because—" She stopped herself. Her hands had gone still on the supply jars. "Because she believed in the right thing at the wrong time." Mae looked at the girl who wanted to be a doctor in a time and place that had no framework for that want, who had appeared at her door at 3 in the morning with blood on her blouse and no hesitation at all, who counted bandage rolls with the focus of someone who understood that small, precise acts were the architecture of large outcomes. "I don't know if it's possible," Mae said. "I think it might be. I think we have more pieces than Foss expects us to have." She paused. "But I need you to understand something, Elena. Possible doesn't mean without cost. It means worth the cost. Those are not the same thing." Elena absorbed this. Then she picked up the first supply jar and went back to work, which was, Mae had learned, her version of yes. The Garza ruling came down at noon. Daniel found in favor of the family on every point. He cited the original land grant, the inadequate evidence for Foss's adverse possession claim, and 3 procedural errors in Foss's attorney's filing that he had, by his own acknowledgement in the written decision, previously overlooked. The decision was 2 pages longer than his decisions usually ran, as if he were making up for lost time in the plain documentation of what was actually true. Word reached Rosaria's cafe before 1 o'clock, carried by a ranch hand who'd been in the courtroom and walked directly from there to the cafe and told everyone within earshot, with the energized disbelief of a man who has just watched something he'd stopped expecting happen. The reaction split immediately and predictably down the line between people who felt something loosen in their chest at the news and people who went quiet and looked at their plates and started calculating. Mae was treating a child's ear infection when she heard the reaction in the front room. She finished what she was doing, thanked the mother, walked out into the cafe, and found Rosaria behind the counter with an expression that contained several things at once. "He'll be here by tonight," Rosaria said quietly. "Foss." Or his representative. Foss prefers representatives for the first conversation. It gives him distance if the conversation doesn't go the way he wants. She wiped the counter with a cloth, a motion she repeated when she was thinking. 22 years, Mae. I have managed 22 years by being useful and quiet and not making myself a problem. I know. I have a daughter who wants to be a doctor. Rosaria stopped wiping. She looked at the counter for a moment. 22 years ago, I thought, if I keep my head down, if I build something slow and solid and careful, maybe by the time Elena is grown, it will be different. Maybe by then, there will be room. She looked up. I was wrong. There is never room unless someone makes it. Mae didn't say anything. There was nothing to say to that. Don't apologize to me, Rosaria said, reading her face. I made my choices. I'm making another one now. She put the cloth down with the finality of a woman drawing a line. What do you need from me? Foss's representative arrived at 4 o'clock. He was a lawyer named Aldous Chambers, thin and correct, with a leather case and the practiced pleasantness of someone paid to deliver bad news in tones that made it seem like generosity. He asked for Mae by name, which was itself a message. That Foss knew where she was, had always known, had simply been waiting. Mae met him at Rosaria's corner table. She folded her hands on the table and looked at him steadily and let him talk. He talked for several minutes. He discussed the medical board complaint, the lease situation, the concerns of several town council members about the nature of Mae's practice and its potential health risks to the community. He used the word concern 7 times. He used the word unfortunate 4 times. He never once used the word Foss. What does he want? Mae said when Chambers paused. I represent the council, Mrs. Calloway. You represent Reginald Foss. We both know that. What does he want? Chambers looked at her with the expression of a man recalibrating. He would like the situation to resolve quietly. He has no personal animosity toward you. He simply believes that Denton's Crossing functions best when certain boundaries are respected. Which boundaries specifically? Your practice, its location, its clientele. He paused with the delicacy of a man stepping around something. There are concerns that the services you're providing are creating unrealistic expectations among the labor community regarding medical care, Mae said flatly. Regarding certain standards that are not economically sustainable in a town of this size. Mae looked at him for a long moment. Mr. Chambers, I have been in Denton's Crossing for 2 months. In that time, I have treated 47 people who had no other access to medical care. 2 of those cases, had they gone untreated, would likely have resulted in death within weeks. One of them was a 12-year-old girl. She paused. What Mr. Foss is asking me to do is to stop. And the reason he wants me to stop is not sustainability. It is that healthy workers with access to medical care are workers who understand their own value. And workers who understand their own value are harder to underpay and underserve. Chambers was quiet. Tell Mr. Foss that I appreciate his concern, Mae said, and that I will be at my practice tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock, as usual. Chambers left. Rosaria emerged from the kitchen, where she had been audibly not listening. He'll move faster now, she said. I know. Mae. Rosaria's voice carried something careful. Tom Birch sent word this afternoon. Someone broke into his back office last night. Nothing was taken, but the lock on his file cabinet was damaged. Mae went very still. The records, she said. He moved them last week. He had a feeling. Rosaria paused. But whoever did it doesn't know that. Which means Foss thinks he got there in time. Which means Foss thinks he's safe. Mae turned this over. Which means he'll move openly now. No more quiet pressure. He won't think he needs it. That makes him more dangerous. It also makes him less careful. They looked at each other across the length of the cafe. Where did Tom move them? Mae asked. I don't know. Tom doesn't tell people things he doesn't need them to know. It's kept him alive and in business for 11 years. Rosaria paused. But I think Daniel knows. Daniel came to the house late, well past dark, and Mae heard him in the kitchen and came out and found him standing at the stove making coffee with the focused deliberateness of a man who needed something to do with his hands. Chambers came to see me after he left here, he said, without turning around. What did he say? That I had made a serious error in judgment this morning. That the Garza decision would be reviewed. That certain people in the county judiciary had concerns about my stability. He poured 2 cups and turned around. Foss's word for judges who rule against him is unstable. It's cleaner than corrupt. Implies they've lost their capacity for good judgment rather than found it. Mae took the cup he held out. Tom's records. He brought them to me this afternoon. Before the break-in, he'd already guessed it was coming. Daniel looked at her over the rim of his cup. 11 years of documented financial manipulation, bribery of public officials, fraudulent land claims, and 2 cases of what Tom believes was deliberate destruction of property attributed to others, one of which was a fire. A fire, Mae said. A grain store belonging to a Mexican farmer named Vasquez, who'd organized a wage complaint in 1871. The fire was ruled accidental. Vasquez left the territory. He paused. Tom had a witness who came to him at the time, too frightened to go on record. But Tom wrote it down. Mae was very quiet. The kitchen was warm, and the coffee was strong, and somewhere outside, a wind had come up from the south, carrying the edge of rain. If we take this to the county authorities, Foss moves to discredit everything before they can act, she said slowly. We've talked about this, but if Foss thinks the records are gone, then he moves openly, boldly, and openly means witnesses. Daniel set down his cup. Tom has been waiting for Foss to make a visible mistake, one that's hard to explain away. One that happens in front of enough people that no amount of money or pressure can fully contain it. He's going to push harder now, at Rosaria, at you, at the workers who've been coming to the practice. Mae looked at him. At Elena. Something crossed Daniel's face. Tell me what you're thinking. I'm thinking that the worst thing we could do right now is react, scatter, try to protect each one thing individually. She set down her own cup. He's counting on that. Divide us by threat. Make each person calculate their own cost separately. And what do we do instead? We make the cost collective. She met his eyes. We make it so that moving against any one of us moves against all of us, publicly, visibly, in ways that Denton's Crossing can't look away from. Daniel was quiet for a long moment. The wind outside had strengthened, pressing against the window glass, and the lamp on the table threw long shadows across the kitchen. That requires trust, he said, from people who have very good reasons not to trust that things can be different. I know. Rosaria has 22 years of reasons to be careful. I know that too. And I have 6 years of reasons that people might reasonably look at me and wonder which direction I'll move when the pressure gets heavy enough. He said it directly and without flinching, which was one of the things she had come to recognize as simply the way Daniel Holt moved through the world when he was being honest. That is a legitimate concern, Mae. I am not asking you to dismiss it. She looked at him for a long moment, at the man who had sat in the dirt until dawn, who had ruled on the actual merits of a case and written 2 extra pages because he had ground to make up, who was standing in his own kitchen at 10 o'clock at night, telling her the reasons she might not be able to trust him because he thought she deserved to have the full picture. I'm not dismissing it, she said. I'm accounting for it. She paused. The question is not whether you've been wrong before. The question is who you are when it gets harder than it's ever been. He held her gaze without moving for what felt like a long time. I know who I want to be, he said. Then be that. Mae picked up her cup again. Starting tomorrow. She didn't sleep well. The wind came in stronger overnight, rattling the cedar shutters, and she lay in the plain, spare room in Daniel Holt's house in Denton's Crossing, Texas, and thought about James, about the water filtration reports filed and unfiled, about the plaque on a building he never saw, about the difference between arriving too late and arriving exactly when you were supposed to. She thought about Elena, counting bandage rolls with ink-stained fingers, about Rosaria putting her cloth down with the finality of a woman drawing a line, about Tom Birch holding a match near a powder keg for 11 years, waiting for a reason. She thought about Daniel's voice in the dark kitchen saying, I know who I want to be, with the particular honesty of someone who had learned the hard way that knowing and doing were not the same distance apart for everyone. She thought about Reginald Foss in whatever house he slept in, calculating. She thought about a boy named Hector Ruiz, whose femur was healing clean in Wichita Falls, whose wife had sent word through her brother at the telegraph office that the surgeon there had said the splinting was the finest field work he had seen outside a military hospital. At some point before dawn, the wind dropped. The cedar shutters went still. The night settled into that particular quiet that only comes after weather has passed and before the next thing has arrived. Mae Calloway closed her eyes. She did not think about the train. The trouble came on a Wednesday, which was laundry day at Rosaria's cafe, and Mae would remember that detail later with the particular clarity of someone cataloging the ordinary texture of the moment before everything changed. She was in the storeroom when she heard Elena's voice rise in the front room. Not frightened, furious, which was different and in some ways worse, because Elena did not lose her composure easily, and when she did, it meant the thing in front of her was genuinely beyond the acceptable boundary of what she had agreed to tolerate. Mae came through the door to find 2 men she didn't recognize standing at the counter with a particular posture of people who had been sent somewhere and given instructions and intended to follow them regardless of the response. One was holding a document. The other had his thumbs in his belt and was looking at Elena the way certain men look at young women who were speaking to them directly, as if the directness itself were the offense. "What is this?" Mae said, not a question. The man with the document turned. He had the look of a county official, the look that comes from years of delivering paperwork in situations where paperwork is a weapon dressed as procedure. "Mrs. Calloway, I'm looking for the proprietor of this establishment. A Mrs. Rosaria Vega." "I'm here." Rosaria came from the kitchen, drying her hands, and Mae could see from the set of her shoulders that she had heard everything, and was already contained and ready in the way that takes years to learn. "Ma'am," he held out the document. "Notice of lease non-renewal, effective January 1st. The property owner has elected not to continue the current tenancy agreement." Rosaria took the paper with both hands and read it without expression. Then she folded it once and held it at her side. "January 1st is 6 weeks away," she said. "Yes, ma'am." "And the reason given?" "Change of property use. The owner intends to repurpose the building for railroad company storage." He paused, with the careful neutrality of a man who knows exactly what he is doing, and has decided that knowing it doesn't require him to stop. "I'm sorry for the inconvenience." "You are not," Elena said, "sorry for anything." "Elena," Rosaria's voice was quiet and final. The men left. The cafe was very still for a moment, the kind of stillness that has weight. Two of the railroad workers at the back table had gone motionless over their plates, and Mae could feel them listening, could feel the familiar calculation she had watched people perform 100 times in the past 2 months. The assessment of what this moment cost, and whether bearing witness was a luxury they could afford. Mae looked at Rosaria. Rosaria looked back at her with an expression that was clear and without self-pity, and contained, at its edges, something that might have been the beginning of a decision. "He waited until I was useful to you," Rosaria said, "until refusing to serve you would have cost him the worker's business. So instead, he takes the building." She set the paper down on the counter. "Efficient." "Where will you go?" Mae asked. "I have no idea." She said it plainly, without drama. 22 years I have been building this. The kitchen equipment alone." She stopped herself. "It doesn't matter. What matters is what we do now." "What do you want to do?" Rosaria looked at her for a long moment. Then she looked at Elena, who was standing with her back very straight and her hands flat on the counter and her jaw set in the exact expression Rosaria herself wore when she had made a decision she intended to live with. "I want," Rosaria said carefully, "to stop being managed." Mae went to find Daniel. He was at the courthouse, where she had learned not to interrupt him during sessions. But the session had ended early. She could tell from the particular quality of the silence in the building, and from the way the court clerk looked at her when she came in, with the expression of someone sitting on news that was too large for the room. She found Daniel in his office with Tom Birch already there, which told her that Tom had heard first and moved faster. "Tell me," she said. Daniel looked up. There was something different in his face. Not the careful neutrality she had grown accustomed to reading, but something raw underneath it. Something that had been pressed down for a long time and was now close to the surface. "Foss's attorney filed a motion this morning to have the Garza decision reviewed by the circuit court," he said. "That's expected, and I can handle it. But he also filed a separate complaint with the State Judicial Board, claiming that my ruling demonstrated bias and potential corruption." He paused. "Specifically, he is alleging that my decisions have been influenced by my personal relationship with an unlicensed medical practitioner whose agenda is to destabilize the labor economy of Archer County. The room was very quiet. Personal relationship, Mae repeated. Yes. He's using us against each other, Tom said from his chair by the window. He had his notebook open on his knee, but wasn't writing in it. It's clean. Attack Daniel's credibility through Mae. Attack Mae's legitimacy through Daniel. Neither one can defend themselves without appearing to confirm the other accusation. How long before the judicial board acts? Mae asked. 6 to 8 weeks for a formal review. But Foss doesn't need the board to act. He just needs the complaint to exist. It's already in the county paper in Abilene, the version Foss's people wrote. Tom paused. I received a copy this morning. The headline calls Daniel a judge who has abandoned judicial impartiality for personal entanglement. Mae sat down. She did not often sit down in the middle of a situation, but she sat down now because she needed to think, and thinking required stillness. He's moving on all of us at once, she said. Rosaria's lease, your judicial complaint, the medical board. Tom, has he moved against you directly yet? Not yet. Tom's voice was careful. Which means he still thinks the records were destroyed. When he discovers otherwise, he'll come for you last, Daniel said, or he'll try to discredit you preemptively. Call the records fabricated. Question your motives. He looked at Mae. We need to move before he works out that Tom still has them. Moving means going to the federal marshal's office in Dallas, Mae said. Tom's records, your testimony, the witness statements from the Garza case. Everything documented and in federal hands before Foss can get there first. That takes time we may not have, Tom said. Dallas is 2 days by rail. The marshal's office would need... I know a man in the marshal's office, Daniel said. Both Mae and Tom looked at him. His name is Richard Carey. We rode together briefly during the war, on the Union side, which is a thing I don't advertise in this county. He is currently stationed in Dallas, and he is the single most difficult man to bribe I have ever encountered in 30 years of watching men get bribed. He paused. I wrote to him 3 weeks ago. Mae stared at him. 3 weeks ago? The night after Hector Ruiz, before you moved out of the boarding house, before the Garza ruling. He met her eyes directly. I told him I had evidence of sustained corruption by a prominent county businessman, and that I needed to know what the federal threshold was for intervention. You didn't tell me? No. Why? He was quiet for a moment. Not the careful quiet of a man managing what he revealed, but the harder quiet of a man choosing honesty over convenience. Because I didn't know yet if I was going to go through with it. Because telling you would have made it a commitment, and I was not certain I was ready to make it. He paused. And because I did not want you to stay in Denton's Crossing, based on the belief that I was further along in my courage than I actually was. Mae held his gaze. The morning light came through the courthouse window and fell across the desk between them, and she thought, not for the first time, that honesty was a harder gift to receive than comfort, because it didn't allow you to build anything on false ground. What did Carey say? She asked. He said send the evidence and he'd assess it. He said if it was what I described, he could be here in 10 days. Daniel paused. I sent Tom's records to him yesterday, by private courier, not the railroad post. Tom made a small sound. You might have mentioned that. I'm mentioning it now. The records were copies, Tom said, and something in his voice was almost amused. I sent him the originals last week, by a different courier. He looked at Daniel. I also wrote to Carey, about 2 weeks before you did. The silence that followed had a particular texture. Mae looked between the two men. A judge who had spent 6 years on the wrong side of his own conscience, and a newspaper editor who had spent 11 years holding a match he finally wanted to light. and felt something shift in the room that she didn't have a clean word for. Not relief exactly. More like the sensation of foundations being checked and found solid. "We should have been talking to each other from the beginning," she said. "Yes," Daniel said. "We are now," Tom said. Mae stood up. "Then here is what we do. Carrie is 10 days out at best. Foss is moving now, which means we need to slow him down without showing him that we're slowing him down." She looked at Tom. "The story in the Abilene paper. Can you write a response? Not defensive, factual. The Garza ruling on its merits. The medical board complaint on its procedural basis. The lease non-renewal in its proper context." "I can write it by tonight, and you can get it in front of people before Foss can pressure distribution?" "I have relationships with 3 other county papers that Foss doesn't own. It won't reach everyone, but it will reach enough people who ask questions for a living that it creates static." He used the word with the precision of a man who understood information as terrain. "Foss likes clean narratives. Static is expensive for clean narratives." "Good." She turned to Daniel. "The judicial complaint. Is there a procedural response you can file that keeps you on the bench while the review is pending?" "There is. It requires documentation of the basis for my rulings and a formal statement of judicial independence. It's the kind of filing that usually signals a judge who is about to be removed." He paused. "In this case, it will signal a judge who intends to keep ruling." "File it today." "Already drafting it." She picked up her coat. "I need to go back to Rosaria." Daniel stood. "Mae." She turned. He was looking at her with the expression she had learned to read as the one that came before the things he found hardest to say. "Whatever happens in the next 10 days, whatever Foss does before Carrie arrives, I need you to know that I am not going to move from this." He paused. "Not because of the evidence, not because of Carrie. Because I have watched you for 2 months make the same choice every single day without requiring it to be easier than it is. And I cannot watch you do that and remain the man I have been." Mae looked at him for a long moment. "Daniel." "I'm not asking for anything," he said quickly. This is not a condition or a negotiation. I just need you to know that you are not standing out there alone." "I know," she said. And then, because it was true, and because he deserved to hear true things, "I knew it the morning after Hector, when you were still there." She left before either of them could turn it into something more than it was ready to be. Rosaria had not moved the folded lease notice from the counter when Mae returned. It was still sitting there, and Mae understood that it was sitting there deliberately, that Rosaria was letting herself look at it because she was the kind of woman who faced things directly, rather than putting them in drawers. "I have a thought," Mae said. "I have several," Rosaria said. "None of them gentle." "The building next to the smithy on Crane Street, the one that's been empty since the hardware merchant left." Rosaria looked at her. "It's a wreck." "It has a kitchen space. It has square footage. It has a back room large enough for the practice." Mae set her bag down on the counter. "And it belongs to the Garza family, who won their land case yesterday, and who I suspect would be willing to discuss a lease arrangement with a woman who is currently inconveniencing the man who spent 4 years trying to take their property." Rosaria was quiet for a moment. She picked up the lease notice and held it with both hands and looked at it. And something moved across her face that was grief and anger and something harder to name. The expression of a person setting down one version of their life in order to pick up another. "It would take weeks to make it functional," she said. "Yes. I would lose the customer traffic from this location. The workers come here because it's close to the yard." "The Crane Street building is closer to the yard." Rosaria looked up. 3 blocks closer, Mae said. I measured this morning. A long pause. Then Rosaria set the notice down, smoothed it flat with one hand, and folded it in half again with the deliberate finality of someone filing something away permanently. I'll speak to the Garzas this afternoon, she said. The afternoon brought a new problem in the form of Walt Calhoun, who arrived at the storeroom doorway while Mae was treating a miner's severely infected hand with the look of a man who was, as Rosaria had once described, delivering bad news he didn't enjoy delivering. Foss wants you brought in for questioning, he said. Formal this time. Related to the medical board complaint. He's claiming you've been dispensing medication without authorization and that there's been a patient harmed. Mae's hands stilled on the bandaging. Who was harmed? He hasn't named anyone yet. Says the specifics are part of the investigation. Calhoun looked at the floor briefly. Mae, I know what this is. I know he's manufacturing it. But I have a badge and a salary and what, Walt? He looked at her directly for the first time. He was not a bad man. He was the particular kind of man that bad systems produced in great quantities. Capable of basic decency in small moments, incapable of it in large ones, haunted by the gap between the two. I have a daughter, he said. She's been coming here for 2 weeks, for the cough she's had since spring that Preston said was nothing. His voice was very level. You told her it was early bronchitis, and you gave her something for it, and she's been sleeping through the night for the first time in 4 months. Mae was quiet. I know what you're doing here, he said again, and I know what Foss is doing. And I have been telling myself for a long time that they are 2 separate problems, and I only have authority over one of them. He stopped. His jaw worked briefly. But they're not separate, are they? No, Mae said. They're not. He was quiet for a long moment. The miner whose hand she'd been treating was very still, his eyes going between them with the careful attention of a man calculating whether this was safe to witness. I can't arrest you, Calhoun said finally. I won't find sufficient grounds. Procedural problem with the complaint documentation. He straightened his hat. That'll take me until tomorrow morning to determine. Maybe longer. He left without another word. Mae finished the bandaging. The miner looked at her. Foss is going to push harder now, the man said. He was a quiet man, a Tejano named Aguilar, who had been coming to the practice for 3 weeks and who spoke less than anyone she'd treated and observed more. When the sheriff won't move, he'll try something else. I know. He did something else before, with Vasquez, the grain store fire. Aguilar looked at his newly bandaged hand. My brother-in-law worked with Vasquez. He saw what happened. He saw who said it. He paused. He never told anyone because Foss's men came to him the next morning and described his children by name and by the route they walked to school. Mae looked at him. Would he testify? If there were federal authorities present, if he were protected. Aguilar was quiet for a long time. There is no protection in this county that Foss cannot reach. Federal protection, Mae said. The word federal sat between them. Mae watched Aguilar's face move through calculation and fear and something older underneath both of them. The accumulated weight of a family that had survived by being careful and was being asked to consider what careful had actually cost them. I will speak to him, Aguilar said finally. I cannot promise more than that. That's enough. That night, Mae sat at the kitchen table with Daniel and laid out everything. Calhoun, Aguilar, Rosaria's plan, Tom's static, the 10 days until Carrie. Daniel listened without interrupting, which he had come to understand as his most serious mode of attention. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Foss will figure out the records weren't destroyed within the next day or two, he said. When he does, he'll stop being careful about what's visible. I know. That means Tom. And it means Elena. He said the last name with the particular deliberateness of someone naming a specific weight. Elena has been your right hand since the beginning. Foss knows that. And she is 16 years old and the daughter of the woman whose lease he just canceled. Mae felt the cold precision of it. He'll use her to reach Rosaria. Or he'll use her to reach you. She looked at the table. The lamp threw its warm circle, and outside, the Texas night was enormous, and still, and indifferent in the way of places that have been witness to a great many human dramas and have not changed their fundamental nature as a result. I will not let anything happen to that girl, Mae said. Neither will I. Daniel's voice was very steady. But we need to tell her, both of them, everything. They have the right to know exactly what they're standing inside. Rosaria already knows. Elena is not Rosaria. Elena, Mae said, is exactly Rosaria. Younger and less practiced, but the same thing underneath. She paused. She will want to know, and she will want to stay in it. I know. Daniel looked at her across the table. That's what worries me. Mae looked back at him, at the badge on his coat that no longer looked incongruous, at the man who had written to a federal marshal 3 weeks ago without telling her, and had told her the truth about why, and had been at the storeroom doorway that morning before she'd asked him to be there. Daniel, she said. Yes. When this is over, she stopped. He waited. When this is over, she said again, more quietly, I would like to have a conversation that is not about Reginald Foss. Something shifted in his face. Something that had been held carefully in place for a long time moved. And underneath it was something plain and real, and entirely without the careful management she had watched him apply to almost everything else. I would like that very much, he said. They sat together in the warm kitchen with the lamp burning low, and the 10 days stretched out ahead of them, like a road that couldn't be walked faster than it could be walked. And Mae thought about what Rosaria had said about making room, about how there was never room unless someone made it. She thought about Elena's ink-stained hands counting bandage rolls. She thought about Aguilar saying, I will speak to him. She thought about Calhoun's voice saying, that'll take me until tomorrow morning. She thought about all the small, ordinary acts of decency accumulating in the dark, like water finding its level, patient and indifferent to the obstacles placed against it, moving always in the direction it was always going to move. She was not afraid. She was something more complicated than afraid, alert and awake, and absolutely clear about where she stood and why. Outside the window, Denton's Crossing was quiet, but it was the quiet of a place gathering itself. And Mae Calloway, who had learned to read the difference between silence and stillness, knew that by morning, neither one of them would hold. The trouble with Foss, Mae had learned, was that he understood patience the way a surgeon understood anatomy, not as a virtue, but as a tool, precise and without sentiment. So when the next move came, it did not come as she expected. It came through Elena. Mae was at the Crane Street building with Rosaria at 7 in the morning, walking the space and calculating what could be done with it, when Pilar Ruiz appeared in the doorway, breathing hard, and with the expression of a woman carrying news she had run with rather than walked. The girl, Pilar said. Elena. 2 men took her off the street 20 minutes ago, in front of the telegraph office. In front of 6 people who did nothing. Mae was moving before the sentence finished. She heard Rosaria behind her, heard the sound of a woman whose careful composure had just met its absolute limit, heard her say something in Spanish that Mae didn't know but understood completely. She heard her own boots in the packed earth of Crane Street, and then Main Street, and she did not think about anything except the fact that Elena Vega was 16 years old and had ink on her fingers and wanted to be a doctor and had done nothing in her life except be present and capable and willing. Daniel was already at the sheriff's office when Mae arrived. He had his judge's coat on and his hat in his hand, and he was standing in the middle of the room with Walt Calhoun, and his voice when she came through the door was the quietest she had ever heard it, which meant he was angrier than she had ever seen him. "Where is she?" Mae said. Calhoun turned. His face had the look of a man standing at a junction with no good road out of it. "Chambers has her, at Foss's office on the North End. He's claiming she was witness tampering with the railroad company's mail distribution on behalf of an unlicensed medical operation." "That is a fabrication," Mae said. "I know it's a fabrication." "Then get her out." Chambers is citing a county business protection statute that gives property owners the right to detain individuals suspected of interfering with commercial operations pending. "Walt." Daniel's voice cut clean across the room. "That statute was written for livestock theft in 1861 and has never been applied to a person. You know that. I know that. Chambers knows that. This is a hostage situation dressed in paperwork, and you are the sheriff of this county." Calhoun's jaw worked. Mae watched him and saw the same calculation she had watched him perform a dozen times. The same junction, the same roads. Except this time, there was something different in his face. The thing that had been moving in him since the night he told her about his daughter's cough had finally reached the surface. "If I go out there," he said slowly, "and challenge Chambers directly, Foss will have my badge by nightfall." "Probably," Daniel said. "And my salary, and my pension." "Yes." Calhoun looked at the floor. He looked at it for a long time. Then he picked up his hat and put it on, and checked his gun belt with the automatic precision of a man who had spent 20 years making that gesture mean something. "My daughter's been sleeping through the night," he said. He didn't look at either of them. For the first time since spring. He walked to the door. "You two stay 6 steps behind me and don't say anything until I've said what I need to say." They found Elena in the outer room of Foss's railroad office, sitting in a hard chair with her hands folded in her lap, and her back straight, and her expression of contained fury so identical to her mother's that Mae felt something fierce move through her chest. Chambers was there with another man Mae didn't recognize, and behind them, in the doorway of the inner office, stood Reginald Foss himself. It was the first time Mae had seen him in person, and he was exactly as she had constructed him from 2 months of second-hand evidence. Impeccably dressed, soft-handed, with a particular stillness of a man who had not been surprised by anything in years, because he controlled too many variables for surprise to find a way in. He looked at Mae, and he looked at Daniel, and he looked at Calhoun, and his expression didn't change. "Sheriff," he said pleasantly, "I wasn't expecting a formal visit." "Release the girl," Calhoun said. "She's being held under the county business protection." "I know what statute Chambers cited. I also know that statute has never been applied to a person in 17 years of operation, and that any judge in this state would have it thrown out in under 10 minutes. Calhoun's voice was very level. "Release the girl, Mr. Foss, or I will charge Chambers with unlawful restraint and you with conspiracy to the same, and Judge Holt will be available to sign the paperwork within the hour." A silence settled over the room. Foss looked at Calhoun the way a man looks at a piece of furniture that is unexpectedly moved. Then he looked at Daniel. "You've made a serious error in judgment, Daniel," he said, almost gently. "Several of them recently. I have been patient. I have given you time to reconsider." "I've reconsidered," Daniel said, "in the other direction." Foss looked at him for a moment. Then he looked at Mae. And in that look she saw something she recognized. The look of a man recalibrating, adjusting, already thinking 3 moves ahead, even as the current board shifted against him. He was not frightened. He was not even angry. He was calculating. "Let her go, Aldous," he said. Chambers stepped aside. Elena stood without hurrying, without looking at anyone except Mae, and walked across the room and stopped in front of her. She was completely unharmed and entirely composed, and Mae could see in her eyes the thing she'd been holding for however long she'd been in that chair. Not fear, but the white-hot clarity of someone who has just had something confirmed that they already knew. "I'm fine," Elena said. "I know," Mae said. "He wanted to frighten my mother." "I know that too." "It didn't work," Elena said. "I want you to know that. Whatever he thought it would accomplish, it didn't work." Mae put her hand briefly on the girl's shoulder. Then she turned and looked at Foss. He was looking back at her with the patience of a man who had not yet played his hand and knew it. "Marshal Carey arrives day after tomorrow," Mae said, quietly. "Just for him. From Dallas. He has 11 years of Tom Birch's records, and your 2 sets of ledgers, and 3 witness statements, including one from a man who watched your employees set the Vasquez fire in 1871. She paused. "I thought you should have time to speak to a lawyer." Something moved across Foss's face, very small, very fast. And then it was gone, and the stillness was back. But it was a different kind of stillness now. The stillness of a man who had just felt the ground shift and was reassessing the distance to solid footing. "You're bluffing," he said. "I have never bluffed about anything in my life," Mae said. "Ask anyone who knows me." She walked out. The next 2 days were the longest Mae had spent in Denton's Crossing, which was saying something. Foss did not move against them again directly, which was almost worse than if he had. The stillness of a man conserving force was harder to read than the motion of a man spending it. Tom Birch published his response piece in 3 county papers on Thursday morning. It was precise and factual, and written with the restraint of a man who had been saving his words for 11 years and knew exactly which ones to spend. It did not accuse. It documented. There was a difference, and Tom understood it the way a surgeon understood the difference between cutting and destroying. Rosaria signed a lease agreement with the Garza family on Thursday afternoon. Carmen Garza, who was 60 years old and had watched her family's land case work through Daniel's court 4 times in 4 years, sat across the table from Rosaria and pushed the paper toward her and said simply, "We take care of our own." Rosaria signed with the pen Carmen handed her, and did not cry until she was outside on the street, and then only for a moment. And then she straightened up and went back to work. Elena did not speak much in those 2 days. She was present at the practice every morning, focused and precise, doing the work with the same competence she always brought to it. But there was something different in her. The chair in Foss's office had done something. Not broken her, nothing like that. It had clarified something, made it sharp and permanent in a way that experience sometimes does to young people who were already going to be extraordinary. On Friday evening, she came to Mae and stood in the doorway of the storeroom after the last patient had left and said, "I want to go to medical school." "I know," Mae said. "I need to know if it's actually possible. Not whether people think it's appropriate, whether it's possible." Mae looked at her directly. "There are 7 women currently enrolled in medical programs in this country. The Women's Medical College of Pennsylvania has been graduating female physicians for 25 years. She paused. "It is possible. It is not easy. It will require money and time and the willingness to be told no by people who are wrong about you." Elena absorbed this. "Will you help me?" "Yes," Mae said. "I will help you." Elena nodded once, with the gravity of someone accepting a contract they intend to honor. Then she untied her apron and went home to her mother. Marshal Richard Carey arrived on Saturday morning on the 9 o'clock train. He was a compact, gray-haired man, with a federal badge and the economical movements of someone who had spent 30 years doing a job that required him to be very clear about what he was doing and why. He shook Daniel's hand without ceremony and looked at Mae with frank assessment. "You're the woman who missed the train," he said. "Several trains," she said. "Daniel's letter said you were the reason he finally got off the fence." He looked at her a moment longer. "I've been waiting for that letter for 3 years." They spent 4 hours with Carey at Daniel's kitchen table, going through everything. Tom brought his originals. Aguilar came with his brother-in-law Roberto, who sat across from a federal marshal for the first time in his life, and told the story of the Vasquez fire in a voice that was quiet and steady, and came from a man who had been carrying that story for 12 years and was ready to set it down. Carey listened to all of it without interrupting. He asked precise questions. He made notes in a federal ledger. And at the end, he looked around the table, at Daniel, at Tom, at Roberto Aguilar, at Mae, with the expression of a man who has received more than he expected. "This is sufficient for federal charges," he said. "Fraud, bribery of public officials, conspiracy, destruction of property. Possibly more, depending on what his mine operations reveal." He paused. "I'll need you all available for depositions next week. I'll need Tom's originals in federal custody. And I'll need Judge Holt to formally recuse himself from any local proceedings related to Foss, which will transfer jurisdiction upward." He looked at Daniel. "That effectively ends your authority over these cases." "I know," Daniel said. "It also protects you from the judicial board complaint. Once it's federal, the county complaint becomes irrelevant." "That's not why I'm doing it." Carey looked at him for a moment. "I know," he said. "That's why it matters." Foss was informed of the federal investigation on Sunday morning. Carey did it personally, which Mae had not expected, but which she understood when Carey explained that he preferred to look men in the face when he told them their options had narrowed. She was not present for that conversation. She heard about it from Calhoun, who had been there as the local law, and who came to Rosaria's, the old location, still operational for 4 more weeks, and sat down at the counter and accepted coffee, and said that Foss had received the information with the same careful stillness he applied to everything, and had asked to speak with his attorney. "That's it?" Mae asked. "That's it." Calhoun wrapped both hands around his cup. 22 years of running this county, and when the wall finally came down, he asked for his attorney and sat down. He was quiet for a moment. "Men like Foss, they're not built for the moment when the power stops working. They spend so much of themselves maintaining it that when it goes, there's not much left underneath." Mae thought about what she'd seen in that brief moment in his office. The flicker of recalculation, the reassessment of distance to solid ground. She thought about the Vasquez family, who had left Texas with nothing. About the Garza family, who had fought for their land 4 times in 4 years. About Hector Ruiz's femur healing clean in Wichita Falls, while his wife sent telegrams through her brother. "What will you do?" she asked Calhoun. "When this is over?" He looked at his coffee. "Keep being the sheriff. Try to be better at it than I've been." He paused. "My daughter wants to know if you're staying." Mae looked at him. "What did you tell her?" "I told her I thought you were." He glanced up briefly. "Was I wrong?" Mae thought about the train she'd missed 8 weeks ago, and every Tuesday since. She thought about the Crane Street building, with its salvageable kitchen, and its back room large enough for a real practice. She thought about Elena's ink-stained hands, and her voice saying, "I want you to help me." She thought about Daniel's voice in the kitchen saying, "I know who I want to be." And the way he had said it, plain and without performance, like a man reading aloud from something he had finally decided to stop keeping to himself. "No," she said, "you weren't wrong." The federal proceedings against Foss took 18 months and resulted in charges that expanded considerably once the marshal's office began examining the mine operation accounts. 3 county officials were implicated. Preston lost his pharmacy license on a separate board ruling in the spring. The judicial board in Abilene dismissed the complaint against Daniel on jurisdictional grounds in February, which was the closest that body ever came to an apology. Tom Birch published every development in the Denton's Weekly Courier, with the meticulous satisfaction of a man finally writing the story he had been taking notes on for 11 years. His readership tripled. He hired an assistant. He stopped looking like a man sitting on something and started looking like a man who had set it down and found he could stand up straighter. The new practice on Crane Street opened in December, 3 weeks after Rosaria's old lease expired. Rosaria hired a second cook and moved her kitchen equipment herself over 2 days with the focused efficiency of a woman who had been doing difficult things without help for long enough that she was very good at it. The cafe was smaller than the old one for exactly 4 months, until a wall came down, and it wasn't. Elena began correspondence with the Women's Medical College of Pennsylvania in January. She wrote her application letter at the kitchen table in Rosaria's apartment above the new cafe at 2 a.m. by lamplight, with the focused intensity of someone writing toward a future they intend to inhabit. Mae read 3 drafts and made precise, honest comments on each one. Elena argued about some of them. Mae reconsidered one and held firm on the others. It was the most useful conversation either of them had had in months. The letter of acceptance came in April. Rosaria read it first because it arrived before Elena was awake, and she held it in both hands for a long time before she set it on the table where her daughter would find it. When Elena came downstairs and saw the envelope and her mother's face, she stood very still for a moment, with her hand over her mouth. Then she sat down and read it 3 times and looked up at her mother. "You're not going to tell me not to go," Elena said. "No," Rosaria said. "Even though it's far, even though—" "Elena," Rosaria's voice was very quiet. "I have been building something in this town for 22 years, so that you would have the room to become exactly what you are. I am not going to tell you not to use it." Elena crossed the kitchen and put her arms around her mother, and Rosaria held on with the particular grip of a woman who knows the difference between holding and releasing, and understands that sometimes love requires you to do both at once. Mae was not present for that moment. She heard about it later from Elena, who told it plainly and without embellishment, which was how she told everything that mattered to her. Mae listened and did not say anything for a moment, and then said, "Your mother is one of the finest people I have ever known." "I know," Elena said. "I'm going to be worthy of that." "You already are." Daniel proposed on a Tuesday evening in May, which Mae would always find quietly funny, given the history she had with Tuesdays in Denton's Crossing. They were on the porch of his house. Their house, by then, by all practical measures, if not yet by formal ones. And the Texas evening was long and gold and enormous, the way Texas evenings are. And he said what he said without preamble or ceremony, which was entirely in character. "I would like to marry you," he said. "Not because it resolves anything practical. Not because it is appropriate or expected. Because you are the person I want to be accountable to for the rest of my life, and I cannot think of a higher standard than that." Mae looked at him for a long moment, at the man who had sat in the dirt until dawn and filed 2 extra pages because he had ground to make up, and written to a federal marshal before he told her. and said, "I know who I want to be in a kitchen at 10 o'clock at night." "Yes," she said. He looked at her. "That's it?" "You said it plainly." "I answered plainly." She paused. "Was there supposed to be more?" "I had anticipated at least a brief negotiation."
Daniel.
She looked at him with the expression she had developed specifically for his particular kind of careful man. The expression that said she saw him clearly and was not going anywhere. "I missed 9 trains for this town. I think that constitutes a position statement." He smiled. It was the kind of smile that had been years in the arriving, the kind that doesn't happen in people who haven't been somewhere difficult first.
I suppose it does.
They married in September in the Crane Street building, between the cafe and the practice, because that was where their life actually lived, and neither of them saw the point in performing it somewhere else. Rosaria made the food. Tom Birch stood up for Daniel with the solemnity of a man who understood he was witnessing something he intended to record accurately. Calhoun came in his badge and his good hat and shook Daniel's hand for a long time without saying anything, which said everything. Roberto Aguilar came with his family and sat in the front row. And when the thing was done, he nodded once, with the gravity of a man witnessing the completion of something he'd had a hand in and was glad of it. Elena was there, in the dress her mother had made for her, already half gone toward Philadelphia and her future, present in body and luminous with the particular light of young people who have been pointed toward something true and can feel the distance closing. She hugged Mae before she left that evening to catch the early train the next morning. "You stayed," Elena said. "I stayed." "Because of him?" Mae thought about this honestly, the way she thought about most things. "Because of Hector Ruiz," she said. "Because of your mother putting her cloth down on the counter. Because of your ink-stained hands at 3 in the morning." She paused. "Because staying was the true thing to do. He was part of why I could do it. But the staying was mine." Elena pulled back and looked at her with the dark, clear eyes that saw faster than she led on. "I'm going to come back," she said. "When I'm done. I'm going to come back and practice here." "I know," Mae said. "I'll be here." 1 year after Mae Calloway had slapped a man across the face in a pharmacy and missed her train, she stood on the Crane Street practice's front step in the early morning and watched Denton's Crossing come to life. The railroad yard still clanged in the distance. The dust still rose on Main Street. The sky was still the enormous flat Texas sky that had looked indifferent to her when she first arrived, and now looked simply honest, which was maybe the same thing from a different angle. Pilar Ruiz brought her son past the practice every Saturday morning. Hector walked without a limp. The fracture had healed clean and true, the way bones do when they are set right and given time. He was back at work on the railroad, which was not without its own irony, and he always nodded at Mae when he passed, with the particular nod of a man who understood the specific weight of what he was acknowledging. The practice treated 63 patients in its first month on Crane Street. The County Medical Board, after a review that coincided poorly with the federal investigation of its most vocal complainant, issued Mae a provisional operating license in March. It was not everything she had asked for. It was more than she had expected, and she intended to use every inch of it. Daniel came out behind her with coffee, stood beside her on the step, and looked at the street without saying anything, which was one of the things she had come to love most about him. His understanding that some mornings didn't require language. She thought about the woman who had stood on a train platform 8 Tuesdays in a row, telling herself this week she would leave. She thought about what that woman had understood about herself and what she hadn't. She thought about James's pocket watch with its cracked crystal and the fact that she had finally, in December, taken it to the watchmaker, and had the crystal replaced. Not because she wanted to change what it meant, because she wanted to be able to read the time clearly. She thought about what it meant to arrive somewhere. Not the train pulling in, not the first step on the platform, but the moment, quieter and harder to locate, when a place stops being the place you landed and becomes the place you live. She had not come to Denton's Crossing to find any of this. She had come to change trains. She had come on her way to somewhere else, carrying a bag of medical supplies and a letter from a man in Santa Fe, and the accumulated weight of a life that had been built around other people's emergencies for so long, she had nearly forgotten that her own life was also an emergency worth responding to. What she had found was not what she had planned, and not what she had imagined, and not what anyone would have written for her in advance, which meant it was real. It was the specific, imperfect, irreplaceable shape of a life that had been actually lived. Mae Calloway drank her coffee on the front step of the practice she had built, in the town she had chosen, in the state that had not made it easy, beside the man who had told her the truth about himself, and meant it, in the morning of a day that was hers to fill, however she determined it should be filled. The train passed through Denton's Crossing at 8:30, the way it always had. She did not watch it go.